Well, thank you. Mostly thank you for coming. I hear you're the only people on campus. Everyone else is on holiday. Welcome to law school. I think that's what the rest of your life is going to be like, isn't it? I'm familiar with your campus, not because I did my master's here, I did it someplace else, but my husband did an MBA here about 150 years ago. And the campus is just as beautiful as it was then, even though it's covered in snow. And the student body is just as vibrant as it was then. And so I'm really happy to be back. Before I start, I want to tell you something. I'm just back from Afghanistan a few days ago because I do a lot of my reporting from there. And something occurred to me, it didn't occur to me, it hit me over the head, as it does in every single country I report from. And it has to do with you. So before I start, I want to remind you, in case I forget at the end, which I was just chatting with some young people, what you are doing, what you're embarking on for your career is the single most important thing that keeps countries running effectively. In country after country after country that I go to, there are judicial systems in the sewer. And that's what makes things wrong. If you don't have a good judiciary, you can't manage. If you have corruption into your judiciary, if you have poorly trained lawyers, your whole country suffers. I tell you that because I've been witnessing it for 25 years. And I tell you because I know what you do is probably hard, and I know what you're concentrating on is probably exams and having to attend lunch hours with speakers and going to classes and all the really hard things you have to do in your life. But what you're doing is important. What you're doing is valuable. And even though our own country is on its feet and a spectacular example to the rest of the world, it can quickly collapse, as we've seen other places collapse, if the judiciary is not functioning with smart, capable, well-trained people. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're thinking this is the hardest thing you've ever done, or the worst thing you've ever done, or if only there'd be a holiday. There's a good ending for all of you. So, as was said, I'm a journalist. I work in zones of conflict, and my beat is to cover what happens to women and girls in these places. And for 25 years, I have not had a good news story to tell. But now I do. And the reason I do, what's the reason I wrote this book? Because you know what? The earth is shifting at last under the status of women, from Kabul and Cairo to, in fact, New York and Nairobi. What we're seeing is women claiming their own space at home, at work, and in the public square like they never did before. And in doing so, and here's the key, these women are propelling changes so extraordinary that they are said to be altering the most intractable files we've ever worked on: poverty, conflict, and indeed the economy. They're also forcing us to look at culture and religion in ways we never looked at them before. I'm going to get to that. I don't want you to think, though, this new wave of change is about giving the little woman a fair break. It's not even about obeying those hard-fought-for international laws that every country signed and hardly any observe. What it is about is the notion that financially the world can no longer afford to oppress half of its population. It's always about money, isn't it? And I suppose those of us who care about the rights of women hope that eventually they'd get to that point. Because now, economists like Jeffrey Sachs of the Millennium Goals fame is claiming that the status of women in the economy are directly related. Where one's flourishing, so is the other. Where one's in the ditch, so is the other. Now, you knew that probably when you were in grade 5, but it didn't get traction. When Jeffrey Sachs says it, it gets traction. So even people like Hillary Clinton, throughout her time as Secretary of State, was the first person to country after country after country claim that the women's story was the story they needed to pay attention to. You know, she said recently, there's 39 civil wars going on in the world today. 31 of them are old wars. They just keep restarting. You know why? Because they ended with ceasefires of exhaustion rather than ceasefires that dealt with what was wrong in the first place. And Hillary Clinton says the same three things are wrong in every civil war. She said, we know now what they are. Their poverty, their lack of education, and the oppression of women. Nobody talked this way before. Hillary Clinton says, if you want to make progress towards settling the world's most intractable conflicts, go out and enlist the women. The pendulum is swinging now. It's swinging hard and fast toward emancipation and away from oppression. This is the best news we've had on the equality file since anyone started studying it. You know, people, when my book first came out, they started asking me, how can you be so positive? I mean, look at the news, look what's going on in the world. Well, let's talk about Malala Yousafzai. In case you happen to miss the story, she was the 15-year-old who decided, a resident of the Swat Valley in Pakistan, that despite the Taliban's orders that girls couldn't go to school, she was going to go to school. And what did the Taliban do? This brave collection of men who claim they act in the name of God, they shot a 15-year-old girl in the head for going to school. You know what? 3 years ago, we would never have heard the story. We wouldn't have heard it. Because over there, they would have said, it's a girl. So did she die? Oh, well, she's a girl. And if we did hear it over here, we would have said, well, I mean, the way they treat their women and girls is appalling, but it's none of our business. Malala's story hit every news broadcast in the world. Every single broadcast in the world. And then remember, she was transferred from Islamabad to London, and she had treatment in London. Then I remember the Globe and Mail did a third-page story with great big diagrams on the cranial surgery they were going to do to this girl and the olfactory implant, cochlear implant they were going to put in to try to get some of her hearing back. I was in Victoria about a year ago now. No, 2 years ago now, and I got a call from CTV News saying, quick, go to the studio. We need a news hit. I said, why? They said, Malala just got out of the hospital. So back she was in the news. A week after that, with her little backpack slung on her back, pink it was, by the way, she was going back to school, and back she went into the news. Malala has become the world's daughter. It's as though we lifted a curtain and everyone said, what the heck were we thinking? Of course these kids have to go to school. She's had an enormous change. Why? Because the stage was ready for that sort of change to happen. She is representing the sound of girls the world over. And as I said, she has become the world's daughter. So how did this change come about? Well, in my research, I tried to find out what happened. I mean, the women's movement as we knew it here was a Western women's movement. It was America and Europe and Australia and places like that. But now it's changed. And in my research, I found there were two big changes. One I called deception. The other I called disease. Women in Asia were not particularly enamored with the Western women's movement, but with the rise of Islamism in the 1990s, the Asian women began to realize they'd become targets of their own people, their own religion, that men were targeting the women in their religion, and they knew if they didn't form a group, their lives would continue to suffer. So they formed groups. The most spectacular one is called Women Living Under Muslim Law. They started in 2 countries. They're now all over the world. They're doing spectacular work, great scholarship, wonderful research, and they're taking on the files that had to be taken on. And they're going public with the things that had to be said. So they formed a group, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. In Africa, with the HIV/AIDS pandemic racing along, the women there said to me, we have no right to say no to sex. And if we don't do something about this, if we don't form a group, we'll all be dead in the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So they grouped. together. And at the same time, the information-based society was inserting itself into the West. And what we saw was a woman's style of management coming into the mainstream. For the first time, we saw networks rather than hierarchies, and shared leadership rather than top-down management. These became the new touchstones in the corporate world. So as I gathered this research, I thought, well, that's what did it, right? Women in Asia formed, women in Africa formed. Now we have this whole information-based society happening. But that's not what did it. What did it was Facebook. When Facebook took off, the women in the world, all over the world, began to talk to each other. Women wearing hijab found out that despite what the fundamentalists told them, women wearing jeans were not all whores. And women wearing jeans found out that despite what they'd heard, women wearing hijab had many opinions, and very valuable opinions. So together, they learned that the impunity and the power of opportunistic men was holding them all back. It was making their future bleak. It was hurting their children or their future children. Now, these women have become a force so powerful that everyone from presidents to pollsters is beginning to see women in a new light as the way to reduce poverty, to cut conflict, to improve the economy. This is a change that centuries of women have worked toward. And it's a new, young, savvy cohort of game changers that are taking on this stage. They represent millions of women the world over who've been trapped in religious dogma and been suffocating in cultural contradictions. You know, until very recently, most of the world was bullied into silence by people who would say, this is none of your business. Can you imagine all the years? I've been covering Afghanistan ever since the Taliban took over. Well, they took over in late fall 96. I got there in March 97. I was a nightmare to the ruling Taliban, and they used to say to me, this is none of your business. You're not from here. You're not in our culture. You're not in our religion. How dare you write about our women? And I used to say to them, what you're doing to your women is not cultural, it's criminal, and it is my business. But I didn't have a lot of people agreeing with me at the time. Now, the whole world knows that these acts against women are criminal. They're not cultural. Some guy made this up, and everybody followed. I can't resist quoting a couple of the men I've been following who have something to say about the work I do. One is an academic from Saudi Arabia, Kamal Subhi, and he commented recently, you probably saw in the paper, about women in Saudi Arabia are not allowed to drive a car, and they decided they were going to begin to protest. All of these protests are bubbling up all over the place now because women have found their own voice. So the women in Saudi Arabia decided to protest, and this academic went to the Saudi Legislative Assembly, and he announced to them that women driving cars would spell the end of virginity in the kingdom. I mean, people got away with saying that rubbish before. In fact, I heard him, I was driving the other day, I heard him on the radio, and he was saying that when women drive a car, they stop ovulating. A friend of mine said, God, I wish I'd known that. Not to be outdone, listen to this from one of the leaders of the Christian right on this side of the water, the Reverend Pat Robertson says, the feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It's about a socialist, anti-family, political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. So there. That's what he thinks. No wonder the young women I'm meeting on assignment today are sneering at old men with old religious customs. You know, women who didn't dare speak up before have now found their voices. They're starting to denounce these cultural practices and these bogus religious claims that have damaged them for centuries. Women are starting to say, show me where it's written in the Quran that my daughter can't go to school. That's not written in the Quran. Those people were making that up. So then the women are saying, well, show me where it's written that I can't go to work. That's not written in the Quran either. It's never a really good idea to lie to women. I dare say that the worst day in the lives of fundamentalists and misogynists and extremists was the day the women around the world started to talk to each other. We cannot claim to be at the finish line here in Canada, and in fact women around the world cannot claim to be at the finish line, but there's traction today like there was never traction before. I want to tell you a couple of stories, a short version of a couple of stories that are in my book to try to prove my point. One of them comes from Afghanistan, the other one comes from Kenya. So let's go to Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the young people have come together and they formed a group called Young Women for Change. There's as many guys as there are women in this group, but that's what it's called. It was started by a pair of young women, Noorjahan Akbar, who's 21, and Anita Haidari, who's 19. And I can tell you their organization is as modern as it is provocative. They're doing this in the world's capital of female oppression, downtown Kabul. And as only young people can do, they said to me, oh, our aim is to reshape the emotional landscape of Afghanistan. Only young people can pull off this kind of talk, and only young people eventually do it. Every major movement in the world today that's changed society has been done by young, usually university students. So Noorjahan pointed out to me that 67% of the population of Afghanistan is under the age of 30. She said, we never started a war. We never took part in a war. We hate these old customs that are hurtful to people. We want change, and we have the tools to make change. We're all on Facebook, she said. And this is extraordinary. Afghanistan's a very primitive place. These young people are just yanking it up by its bootstraps. Will they succeed? The jury's still out. But 67% of the population, this is pretty extraordinary. I said to them, you know, the problem in Afghanistan is if you whisper the word change, they will immediately accuse you of trying to westernize Afghanistan. It's such a demon of a word. When I was early there, I used to be a bit frightened by that accusation. And now I see it as anything that's on time, unchaotic, has less corruption is called Western. So I'm not so worried about it by now. So I said to them, what do you say to the fundamentalists when they accuse you of westernizing Afghanistan? These kids, they're like you, they're brave, they're bold. And so Anita said, she said, I just go right back to them and I say, you think girls' education is Western? You think human rights are Western? You think treating people decently is Western? She said, if that's Western, what's Eastern? I thought, oh my God, these kids are going to get shot. But they're not afraid, they know they're right, and when you have right on your side, you can march with a heavier step. The way they started was incredible. They said, you know what, you can't start a group with 2 people. So we needed more. So we went on Facebook and we said, meet us at such and such a restaurant on such and such a day. And we hoped 5 would come, because with 5 you can start a movement. So 2 things happened. 70 turned up. And the second thing was the proprietor of the restaurant, when he found out what they were up to, he threw them all out. What? Women's rights? Out, out, out. Anyway, what that did was propel them to get their own place. And I can tell you, having been there so recently, there's not a flag flying in Afghanistan today that lets you know, not even the United Nations, although they've painted all their gates blue, so it's sort of obvious, but everyone's pulled down the flag. Everyone's taken out the banner because everyone's afraid of suicide bombers and other people who want to make trouble for you. Not Young Women for Change. They're on Darlamond Road, which is a street where the Parliament is. So help me, they got a banner as wide as this room, and it's written in English and in Dari. This is where the Young Women for Change are. And the things they're doing are incredible. First of all, they have weekly lectures. You can go there and find out what your rights are according to the Constitution of Afghanistan. You can go there and find out what the Quran really does say about your right to go to school and your right to work and your right to choose your own husband. And they build up awareness about the value of having young people on the scene. Now let me tell you this. In Afghanistan, harassment of women and girls in the street is absolutely disgusting. You know, the men own the streets forever. They don't like the fact these women are on the street. Now, mostly women, older women, are staying off the street. They don't want the harassment. But these kids have decided to take it on. Now, for an older woman like me, they call me a whore, they call me an American spy, I kind of like that one, and they call me an infidel, I don't care. But to the young girls, this is a very conservative society. They say the most revolting things about them. They talk about their breasts and their vaginas and what they do to them in a car, and it's a very, very conservative society. These kids stop them in their tracks and they say, who are you to talk to me like that? I'm an Afghan. I own this street just as much as you do. I said, is it working? They said, well, no, but, you know. But like any change in someone's sensibilities, you've just got to keep at it. And I asked them, I said, what are the men doing here? I said, when we started the women's movement in the 60s in Canada, we certainly didn't invite the men to come with us. And I found the same thing when I was in Cairo doing the Women of the Arab Spring. That there were as many young guys as young women in the younger people's movement. And I asked them too, and both groups gave me the same answer. They said, we will never get to the finish line unless we walk together. Such wisdom coming from young people who are in a spot of trouble themselves, we can easily say. You know, they're pressing some pretty reactionary buttons, and I worry about them. I caused some worry myself. I was doing a piece for CBC Radio Ideas last year, and I wanted to record what these guys were saying on the street and play it on the CBC with a translator, of course. And I asked them if they would wear hidden mics in their hijab and do it for me. Well, they thought that was the best idea, but I was worried, right? I was asking them to do something that could create danger, so I said, if one thing goes sideways, drop it. I don't care if you throw the thing away. Do not get yourself hurt. Don't get into trouble. Just drop it. I don't care. They paid not a scrap of attention to a word I was saying. They took off like a legion of Nancy Drews out to get the bad guy, and they were spectacular. I think they walked with their heads even higher that day, and they did get the recordings. But they do stop these men, and the guys grab them. They grope them, for heaven's sakes. I said, what do you do then? Nurjahan said, oh, I scream. I said, you do? She said, the trouble is, she said, I get censored for screaming. They don't get censored for groping me. And she said, that's where we are at this stage. And I said, I mean, can they harass you more than that, push you around? She said, oh, then I just hit them with my backpack. But you know, they feel that they're opening a new dialogue with the men. They feel they're planting a seed of change, and they're willing to keep at it because they think the next time he may think twice about what he's doing. And these girls are changing sensibilities. They have marches to build up awareness about street harassment. And they said to me, one of them said to me, if I said to my grandfather, I'm going into a protest march, he would say, don't you dare, you will bring shame to the family. And if I said to my father, I'm going into a protest march, he'd say, don't you go there, you could get hurt, and that would shame the family. And if I said to my sister, I'm going in a protest march, she'd say, where are you marching? I'll meet you there. So it is the young people, and they're bringing the change that I hadn't seen in Afghanistan ever before this. But I do worry about them. I do worry about who could get in the way and silence these kids. And I said, aren't you a bit scared? They said to me, we have nothing to lose. I said, this is still a country where a raped woman is sent to jail. This is still a country where a woman who gives birth to a girl child can be killed by the family. This is still a country where we have to fight for our rights. And then they said, you know, we've seen what the men can do for 30 years of civil war and the trouble they've had. She said, let's see what the women can do. And to me, it was a new generation at work. To me, there was new hope in the air. And I saw it last week doubled. There's so much more. The young people are in the street. They own the street. And they're prepared to fight back. They said to me, now their English is fine, but I can't resist quoting them exactly as they said this. They said, the olders, look who's talking, they said the olders have made all the decisions for a long time. It's enough. It's not their turn anymore. It's ours. And then, when I was leaving them, Nurjahan said, you know, women haven't made war in this country. Women aren't as involved in the corruption as the men. And you don't see 80% of the men in this country being being beaten by their wives. Again, it's only young people who can speak this way, and they are the change makers in the world for sure. So I believe from the very first story I did in Afghanistan in 1997 that it's the women and girls who can turn this place around and yank it into the 21st century. And I believe they've started that now. It's not easy. The trouble's not over for sure. But I see a change in Afghanistan that I hadn't seen before. The second story I want to tell you comes from Kenya and involves your professor, Melanie Randall. That's how I met her. She was one of the lawyers on this case. Let me tell you what happened. It's amazing. So in Kenya, 160 little girls between the ages of 3 and 17 sued their government for failing to protect them from being raped. Who ever heard of this? No one heard of young people in Afghanistan saying, we're taking over the place. No one ever heard of someone like Malala saying, I am going to school. No one ever heard of little kids taking on their own government and suing them for failing to protect them. This was a case to watch. I couldn't get over there fast enough as a reporter to find out what was going on, and this is how I met Melanie and this incredible collection of Canadian lawyers. Why were they there? Because the Kenyan women, human rights lawyers as well as from 2 other countries, contacted the Canadians because this is the country where the women sued the government for failing to protect them and won. Remember the Jane Doe case, the balcony rapist? And the Kenyan women, as well as women from Ghana and Malawi, said, how the heck did you do that? And the Canadian women said, this is how we did it. And if you want, we'll help you to do yours. So the Canadians came over to show them how to create, and at the end of the day, they decided a constitution challenge. You know, it was pretty dazzling to watch this falling into place because everyone who heard about it said, those kids are going to win. And if they do, they'll alter the status of women in Kenya, maybe even in all of Africa. The suit was the brainchild of a woman called Fiona Sampson. She's a project director at an NGO called the Equality Effect. And there they use international human rights law to improve the lives of girls and women. And Fiona went over there and she met with the woman who runs a shelter where these little kids stay. There's a woman called Mercy Chitty. Mercy Chitty is like the Erin Brockovich of Africa. Nothing stops her. And between those 2 women, Fiona Sampson from Canada and Mercy Chitty from Kenya, they realized that it was time to tackle the root of the problem, which was the impunity of the rapists and the failure of the justice system to convict them. This is what they went after. Now, I want to tell you a little aside. Fiona Sampson admits it's her own sense of urgency that made this concept take flight. Let me describe her to you. You're not supposed to talk about how people look anymore. It's very politically incorrect, but I'm going to talk about it. She's drop dead gorgeous, right? She's got this hair flying around, these great big eyes, and she's little. Someone my size notices that sort of thing. And she's just a lovely person. That's one thing about her. Another thing about her is she's an adventure vacationer. So she goes to Everest Base Camp and she does rock climbing and all this crazy stuff. And she was the chief litigator for LEAF, the Legal Education Action Fund. So she's the woman who was taking precedent-setting cases for women to court, the Supreme Court in Canada, and winning and making lives better for the women and girls coming along in this country. But that's not why I describe her to you. Fiona Sampson is the last born thalidomide child in Canada. Show me by hands. How many of you know what thalidomide is? See, a lot don't know. Thalidomide was a drug given to women for morning sickness when they were pregnant. And horribly, they discovered very quickly as these babies were born that if you took a thalidomide tablet the day the arms were forming, the baby would have no arms. If you took it the day the legs were forming, the baby would have no legs or pieces of it, etc., etc. It was a catastrophe, and they quickly stopped the drug. She's the last born thalidomide child in Canada. And talk about attitude is everything. She said to me, you know what's the worst thing about being a thalidomide child? I said, what? She said, everyone knows your age. The CBC go on every year, and they say that the thalidomide babies are 50 this year. But you know, and the other thing she said to me is it's all about thumbs, you know. She has some serious disabilities in her arms, but she has thumbs that can be used as digits. And she said to me, when my mom was pregnant with me, the pharmaceuticals had impunity. And she said, it's driven me nuts all of my life that people with impunity get away with what they get away with. And when I heard the case, she said, about these kids in Africa, I knew it was about impunity, and I'm consumed with the desire to seek justice in the face of impunity. You see, in Kenya, there's all kinds of laws on the books. You're not allowed to rape kids. In fact, if you rape a kid under the age of 15, the penalty is life in prison. The problem is the laws are not used. The case these women, of which Melanie wrote with them, you should have seen them, they're bivouacked up in this room in Nairobi, boiling to death in the heat. They created a case that said, the state is responsible for the police and the way the police enforce existing laws. Since the police in Kenya failed to arrest the perpetrators and fail on an ongoing basis to provide the protection girls need, they filed notice that the state is responsible for the breakdown in the system. Well, with all due respect to the very clever things you do as lawyers, watching you work is not really exciting. So I left Melanie and her gang. I mean, they have to parse every sentence, dot every I, cross every T, make sure, is everyone going to challenge this part, that part? Hours and hours they spent creating a foolproof case, and I admired you enormously for it, but I couldn't sit in that room any longer. So I got in a truck and went to Meru to meet these little girls. Now, I'm telling you, it's a 4-hour drive north of Nairobi, and it's like going through storybook Africa. We went by banana farms and tea plantations. We went past those dark umbrella-like acacia trees. We inhaled the dry scent of the savannah. We saw bleating goats and signs that declares Jesus saves. They were dotting the landscape. There were mango trees and roadsides drenched in pink and orange and red bougainvillea. They were smacked up against this fluorescent green billboard advertising Safari.com, which is the local cell phone provider. When we crossed the equator, not much changed. It got hotter, but the traffic remained the same. It was fast and a series of near misses all the way. Then we got to Meru. And you know the thing about Africa, I'm sure some of you have been there and the rest of you will soon be there. Africa calls all your senses into action. It's hard to ignore any sense that you have in your body when you're in Africa. And we got to Meru and we turned right down this rutted, red soiled dirt road. And it was shaded by this canopy of beautiful blossoming trees that protected us from the equatorial sun. And along the sides were hedges of purple azalea and yellow hibiscus, and I noticed they were camouflaging a fence that would keep intruders away from this bucolic place that is a refuge for 160 girls who are poised to cut off the head of the snake that is sexual assault. By the time I arrived there, all my senses were on full alert. The first child I met was Emily, and it was the size of that kid that took my breath away. And before I go on, I want to tell you, I don't go around the world interviewing kids who've been raped so I could get my story. I would never, ever, ever do that. This is a test case. There were many counselors and therapists available, and they said, we want the girls to talk because they have to be able to say it in court. Their court is slightly different to ours, and at the end of the day, in fact, they got a ruling that they only had to tell the judge or the what do you call them, prosecutors? But they encouraged the girls to talk, and they told them I was coming, and that's why they talked. So I sat down with Emily. She's barely 4.5 feet tall. Her shoulders, I swear to you, are not 11 inches apart. She's just such a little girl. And you know, her voice was charged with determination when she started talking. You know how little kids have a husky voice? I do because I'm half dead with a cold. But you know how little kids have husky voices? So here's this little girl. She sounded like Walter Cronkite, for heaven's sake. And she's telling me her story. Well, listen to the story. She said, my grandfather asked me to fetch the torch, the flashlight. She said, I was happy to get it for him, but it wasn't the torch he wanted. He took me by force and warned me not to scream or he'd cut me up. You know, along with thousands of men in sub-Saharan Africa, Emily's grandfather has the demented view that having sex with a little girl will cure you of HIV/AIDS. And they think the smaller the child, the stronger the cure. But now Emily's taking the old man to court, the High Court, and she knows this, she's only 11, but she knows she's part of history. And as much as she's a victim, for sure she's a victim, she's empowered by the fact that she's taking action. Nobody took action before. Everybody accepted it as their lot in life. This is what happens to little girls. So along with 159 other little kids, she knows she's the one who could strengthen the status of women in Kenya and maybe all of Africa. She said to me, those men will learn they cannot do this to small girls. So, as I said, she's empowered, but she's a victim. It was 6 days since she'd been raped when I met her, and she was still complaining of stomach pain. She still couldn't sleep. She said to me in her native Kiswahili, it hurts to go to the bathroom. And these people tell me it's none of my business. This is cultural. This is not cultural. This is criminal. This is everybody's business. Child is raped every 30 minutes in Kenya. Some of them as young as 3 months old. If a kid doesn't die of her injuries, she faces abandonment. Nobody wants to have anything to do with a kid who's in a shelter or a kid who's been raped. She almost certainly loses her chance to go to school. She could be because she's sick, she's got a sexually transmitted disease, or she's already got HIV/AIDS, or it could be it was because it was the teacher who raped her. It's always also because of the stigma. There's an enormous stigma around those who have been raped. So without an education, with poor health, and now no means of financial support, this kid drifts into poverty. And I say to you, the young people who are soon going to run the world, she becomes, in my opinion, the poster child for Africa. We look at those pathetic little kids and we think, poor Africa. Is this why Africa can't get on its feet? Is that one of the reasons? Is this something we should be paying attention to? 25% of the girls in Kenya find themselves in this situation, and an estimated 70% never say a word. Why? Because if you tell the police, you get re-raped. If you tell your family, you get kicked out. You don't get support, you get to wear the stigma. And the laws are not enforced, and the practice of defilement, they call it. People always have these polite words for hideous things. The practice of defilement is on the rise. More than 90% of these kids know who raped them. They're related to them. It's their father, their uncle, their brother, the neighbor, the teacher, the priest, the very people struck with the responsibility of keeping vulnerable children safe. And if it's the breadwinner who's guilty, even the mother will say, keep your mouth shut, we'll starve to death if your father goes to jail. One of the women in the shelter said to me, you know, this is our African culture. No one wants to be associated with someone who's been raped or who's in a shelter. She said, it's time we stood up and said, the shame isn't ours, it's yours. And that's what I'm seeing the world over today. At last, people are pointing to the perpetrator. And it's time we did that. But I want to tell you another story. One of the other girls I met there, she's 15 years old, her name's Lookaline, and she'd been raped by a neighbor, and when I met her, she was 39 weeks pregnant. She couldn't go home because she'd get re-raped. Her family couldn't protect her, she stayed in the shelter. But this kid, she talked about what happened to her as though she was a person who wanted to make change rather than a person who was a victim. She said, this happened to me on May the 13th in the year 2010 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I will make sure this never happens to my sister or to anyone I know. I asked her what she was going to do when the baby was born. Now remember, there's a test case. There's help available here. She said, they told me they'll take care of the baby in the shelter, and I can go back to school. Now, in my first life, I was a teacher. In fact, I was a phys ed teacher. It served me very well. I cover war. I spent a lot of time in broken buildings, hiding in a basement with 50 kids who are terrified, and I know 300 games, so it's always been useful to me. But in this case, I'm fascinated to know what kids think they're going to do if they get an education. I always ask them, and I love it when they tell me, oh, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer. Those are the two big ones. And I adore it when little kids in Afghanistan say, I want to be the president of Afghanistan. But Lookaline didn't talk like that. She wasn't, I want to be, I wish I could be. I said, what are you going to do with your schooling? She said, I am going to be a poet. I said, a poet? I don't even want my kids to be poets. You'll starve to death, for God's sakes. And with little prompting, she pulls a book out she's been sitting on. She said, I brought my book of poems. You want me to read them to you? And I did. And I was working for CBC Ideas at that time too, and I recorded what she read. Listen to this. Here I come, walking down through history to eternity, from paradise to the city of goods, victorious, glorious, serious, and pious, elegant, full of grace and truth, the centerpiece and the masterpiece of literature, glowing, growing, and flowing, here, there, everywhere, cheering millions every day, the book of books that I am. This from a 15-year-old girl who's disadvantaged in every imaginable way. She is preparing to sue her government for failing to protect her. That's how change happens. It takes commitment and colossal personal strength for a kid like Lookaline to tackle the status quo and claim a better future for herself. I have to tell you a little aside. There's such a Canadian story. When that played on CBC, a professor at the University of Saskatchewan heard it, contacted the CBC, and said, get in touch with her. I will become her mentor. She had to go through about 87 layers of security to do it. But as you and I sit here today, Lookaline has a mentor and a professor from the University of Saskatchewan. The thing about this case, the reason I followed, I think I've been back there 3 times, you've been there a million times. The reason it dazzled me is this. The journey these kids are on together is about kids who dared to speak out and break the taboo of talking about sexual assault. It's about women lawyers, including your professor, from 2 sides of the world who came together to assist these kids in their quest for justice. It's about little kids who were told they had no rights, and they decided, actually, you know, we think we do. But to me, it's the pushback reaction every woman on this planet has been waiting for, because the win would be something if they managed to win. They took the case to court a year ago, October the 11th, the Girl Day at the UN. And you know, a judge had said to me, a judge in another country said, if those kids win, this is going to create a hullabaloo of Shakespearean proportion. And frankly, when it comes to the rights of women and girls, there's nothing I like better than a hullabaloo of Shakespearean proportion. So that day, the lawyers, did you march with them that day? She probably had to be here teaching you. The lawyers decided they would march from the shelter, it's called Ripples International, to the High Court. So they're marching down the street, and their supporters are all with them, and the kids come pouring out of the shelter saying, we're marching with you. And the lawyers said, no, you can't do that. We have to bar your identity. No one can know who you are. Go back. And the girls said, yeah, well, we're marching. And they jumped in with the march, and these kids went along with them, and all along they're yelling, Haki Yangu, which means this is our story, these are our rights. And they marched all the way to the High Court. So what happens at the High Court? The cops who had re-raped them and humiliated them and hurt them saw them coming. This was a hullabaloo of Shakespearean proportion, and the cops slammed the gates shut of the High Court. Didn't stop those kids. They were up those gates in no time. And they're watching the cops, and one of the girls started to laugh. All this is on film, by the way. She started to laugh, and she called to the other kids. She said, look, look at those cops, the very people who hurt us, the very people who made our lives so miserable, they're scared of us now. And the kids were howling and laughing. Finally, the gates opened and the court proceeded. And on May the 27th, the judge made his decision, and they won. Those little kids won. They won it for 10 million girls in Kenya. The case went around the world. I had an op-ed in the New York Times about it and in the International Herald Tribune. The whole world began talking about it. Why? Because the same as Malala, the earth has shifted. It's time. We can look at these things in a different light today. And this is what happens now. You know, the changes I describe in my book, they're not about women over men, certainly not. They're not about one religion over another or even the West over the East. That's crazy. These changes are about solving the world's most intractable problems. They're about getting poverty off the scene. They're about cutting conflict. They're about boosting the economy. And I can tell you, when I finished the research, I looked at this and I thought, once in a very long while, maybe a lifetime, you get to tell a story that alters the way an entire country, maybe even the world, sees itself. The process of change is usually daring, certainly time-consuming, invariably costly, occasionally heartbreaking, but eventually it's an exercise so rewarding it becomes the stuff of legends. The women's story that I set out to cover for this book is all of that, and something more than its sum. It was Malala who said at the United Nations on July the 12th, when she turned 16, she said, "They thought a bullet would silence us, but they failed. Out of the silence came a voice. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, power, and courage were born." And she said, "One child, one teacher, one book, one pen can change the world." And she's right. Talk about out of the mouths of babes. We're not at the finish line. They're not at the finish line. But as I said, we've got traction. We have momentum like we never had before. Another woman well known to the legal circles in this country, Mary Lou McPhedran, said, "Change does not occur because we want it to occur or because it's fair for a just society. Change occurs because people engage in the process." That's the process you're walking into. When you, the lawyers, engage in the process, you make a better society. I'm thrilled to have had this chance to talk to you, and I hope you'll have some questions for me. Thank you.